starting quickly.
Wow, that's a great silence. I really appreciate that. Welcome. My name is Richard Gruson. I'm a professor of English here at UWM and the director of the Center for 21st Century Studies. I want to welcome you all to the second event of a three-part series that we're sponsoring on regulating speech in the university, which has been organized by the Center with the support of Vice Chancellor for Global Inclusion, Joan, and in conjunction with the Chancellor's year-long Freedom of Expression and Civil Discourse series. I'm pleased now to introduce Chancellor Mark Monet, who will provide a few words of welcome to our distinguished speaker and guests.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome to everybody, and let me first express my appreciation for your leadership, Richard, for what you're doing for the Center for 21st Century Studies and for this series. I'd like you also to join me in welcoming Regent Tim Higgins and Regent Tracy Klein, who are here with us today. And thank you, Division of Global Inclusion and Excellence, the faculty, staff, and students of the Center for 21st Century Study, Dr. Joan, for organizing our series and the larger work for today and the rest of the spring and last fall. Some of you may know that the Center for 21st Century Studies, C21, some describe it as, was founded in 1968, which was a tumultuous decade with protests and counter-protests across the nation and on this campus. It was a very important time. Then and now, the Center plays an important role. As a public university, we'll always be a forum for the free exchange of ideas, even if some of those ideas are disagreeable, even repugnant, and challenge our thinking in sometimes terribly uncomfortable ways. This is not easy. There are difficulties and sensitivities with balancing free speech and speech that obstructs. In today's society, we have seen, unfortunately, an erosion of civility and openness to hear ideas. Our role as educated citizens in a democratic society includes a responsibility to respectfully and thoughtfully address issues and thoughts with which we may not agree. Different speakers on all sides of an issue are expressing their rights to be heard. Free speech is not about who can scream the loudest. It's not about shutting down those with opposing opinions. And this issue, of course, is not new. We'll continue to see it evolve on university campuses, including our own, while it also plays out in other parts of society, and today is seen even more clearly through the lens of different media. My sincere hope is that with this series, we honor our role of teaching, learning, and research and provide the unbiased platform for these important discussions. One of the things that the speaker, Dr. Stone, and I discussed just briefly before this meeting was one of the challenges is just exactly how do we educate not just our students, but really play a role as a public university in particular to have a platform for this type of discussion. And I pointed to this series, and I said this is exactly one of the ways, one of the important vehicles through which we can have understanding and greater discourse about this. So this series helps provide strategies, techniques, and opportunities rooted in ideas to move discourse in a direction that's civil, inclusive of all, and in alignment with our campus's values and the dignity that we uphold at UWM. At UWM, we have an unwavering commitment to inclusivity, civility, equity, and respect. This is a good time for me to introduce our next speaker. Please join me in welcoming Vice Chancellor of Global Inclusion and Engagement, Dr. Joan.
Thank you, Chancellor. Good afternoon, everyone. You can speak, it's okay. Good afternoon. Very good, very good. I will be brief, but I did want to just say a word or two, as the Chancellor said, about why we got where we are here today. As most of you know, that college campuses across the nation have a history of being, I love to call it Switzerland. being that place where you can really spread your wings in teaching, you can spread your wings in learning, you can spread your wings in service, and when you have an opportunity to test not only your opinions and thoughts, but to hear other opinions and thoughts. And in speaking with the Chancellor, we've had many discussions over the last year about what a great place it is to be at a university where you have the opportunity to have those discussions, where you have the opportunity to have top-notch teaching and learning actually happening in real time. And why don't we bring that to a series on free speech and freedom of expression? Many of you know, we started off in September of last year with a kickoff to the series where we asked Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Clarence Page to moderate a panel for us. We are very excited that we were able in the spring semester to partner with the Center for 21st Century Studies, I got it right, 21st Century Studies, as they present a 3-part series that will also look at free speech. We had a wonderful discussion and presentation last month on race and free speech, and I know that Dr. Grusin will speak a little bit about what's coming up as well. So I'm going to ask you to not just sit back and to listen thoughtfully. I'm going to ask you also to really test your own opinions and thinking about how you look at issues that may differ or be similar to what your opinion is, and that and I hope that you understand that there is an opportunity and a place in this world for us to have dialogue across differing opinions, differing thoughts, and at the end of the day, it makes us much better people. This is academically linked. That's what we do here. We're an R1 institution, and that's what we're proud of. So I am pleased to say that there are some students in the audience, but also please know that we're being live streamed to thousands of students, community, and other people as we were in September. So the numbers, this will reach the masses, and we're very proud of that. So having said that, it's going to be my pleasure now to bring to the podium what I like to call my partner in crime. We have had, I think, a wonderful, wonderful opportunity over the last couple of months to help vision out what a series would be that would be applicable to his center for this spring, an opportunity to honor the 50 years of the work that the Center for 21st Century Studies has done. But I also will say this to my friend, Dr. Richard Grusin, that I think that what this also really does is it provides an opportunity to do what we should be doing as the keepers and the holders of the torch around teaching, learning, and research, and that is to give a platform for discussion, for questions, and for pushing us to a new place in our thinking. So having said that, it's my pleasure to bring forward the director of the Center for 21st Century Studies, Dr. Richard Grusin. Oh, I got to do one more thing. I'm sorry, one more quick thing. I have to always, and we should always do this, is salute our interpreters, and if anyone needs some assistance, feel free to come and sit closer to the front. But we have 2 wonderful interpreters with us today, and if you give me 1 second, I can even read their names. Right now we have Nicole Stelzner. Nicole, you can clap. And working with her today is Lauren Rado. Lauren, thank you. And now Dr. Grusin.
Thank you, Joan and Chancellor Monet. This good? Yeah. So before I introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Geoffrey Stone, I wanted to briefly provide some context for today's lecture and for the semester's series on regulating speech in the university. When I learned the Chancellor wanted to put on a series of events this year to take up the question of freedom of expression and civil discourse, I contacted him to offer the center's assistance. After consulting with my faculty advisory committee and meeting with Vice Chancellor Prince, we put together a 3-part series on the question of regulating speech in the university. because speech, including peaceful assembly, has always been regulated and protected in the United States, beginning with the First Amendment to the Constitution. The aim of the series is to ask not if speech should be regulated, but rather how it should be regulated on campus in an era of heightened political tensions and social media attention. At the current moment, the question of freedom of expression in the university is an issue of paramount concern, both nationwide. It is of particular intellectual interest today because calls for absolute rights to free speech have most recently primarily been mounted from the right and even far right, including by Nazis and white supremacists. Throughout U.S. history, especially but not exclusively during the free speech movement of the 1960s, claims for an absolute right to speech were most often made from the left, especially by civil rights and anti-war activists. So this reverse polarity provides, I think, a real interesting question right now about free speech and its function in our society. In February, we hosted the first of our 3 events, a panel discussion on race and free speech on campus, then and now, which took up historical, contemporary, and future interconnections among issues of racial equality and free speech. On April 13th, we'll host the 3rd event of our series, Social Media and Academic Freedom, which will consider the relation between online speech and academic freedom, as well as address the responsibilities of college and university administrators to protect and defend their faculty, students, and staff from orchestrated online smear campaigns. Today's event poses the question, is campus protest protected speech? This question was prompted by recently passed University of Wisconsin system regulations that could suspend or ultimately expel student protesters who were found to have disrupted speakers on campus. Although the language of the regulation is politically neutral, the discussion surrounding its adoption suggested that it was motivated by a sense that conservative speech and thought were no longer welcome on University of Wisconsin campuses. In this afternoon's lecture, Free Speech on Campus, A Challenge of Our Times, Professor Stone will address the broad issue of academic freedom and the challenges of free speech on campus today. Questions he will address include, how does the principle of freedom of expression and the law of the First Amendment apply in the context of higher education? What speech must be tolerated, and what are the boundaries of counter-protest? Among additional First Amendment questions that I hope will be discussed today is whether these new UW system regulations tip the scales of justice by deciding in advance which kinds of speech deserve protection and which deserve punishment. In other words, do the regulations impose punishment for the content of speech by saying that disruption by vocal or other disagreement with an invited speaker is not permissible? This and other questions can be pursued in the question and answer period following Professor Stone's talk. But now to the main event. I'm honored today to introduce you to our distinguished speaker, Geoffrey Stone, Edward H. Levi Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. At moments like this, it's customary to say our speaker today needs no introduction. In the case of Professor Stone, this is certainly the case. I will, however, provide a brief introduction to his extraordinary career, singling out those among his many accomplishments that pertain most directly to our topic today. Professor Stone received his J.D. cum laude in 1971 from the University of Chicago, where he was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. His career began in as auspicious a manner as a law career can, with a clerkship in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, followed by a Supreme Court clerkship for Justice William Brennan in 1972-73. In 1973, Jeff Stone began his academic career as an assistant professor at University of Chicago's Law School, moving up the ranks to full professor and ultimately dean of the law school, followed in 1993 by an almost decade-long term as provost of the university. Professor Stone has published well over 100 scholarly books, edited volumes, law review articles, and other book chapters and essays. In addition, he's a true public intellectual, having written innumerable op-eds, book reviews, short essays, and blog posts. He's spent much of his career as a scholar of constitutional law with a special but not exclusive focus on the First Amendment. Among his most relevant publications for our purposes today, I'll single out two books. The first, co-authored with current president of Columbia University, Lee Bollinger, and published in 2001 by the University of Chicago Press, is Eternally Vigilant: Free Speech in the Modern Era. And in 2004, he published Perilous Times: Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism, which was brought out in paperback by W.W. Norton the following year. He's also published nearly 50 pieces on the First Amendment, which I'll let you track down for yourself. One of the most enjoyable aspects of doing an introduction like this is the opportunity to review the CV of such an accomplished scholar, which inevitably contains some interesting or surprising details. I want to close by mentioning one such detail I uncovered. Before matriculating at the University of Chicago Law School in 1968, Geoffrey Stone received his Bachelor of Science in Economics at the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his graduating class, as many of you may now be surmising, was another man who needs no introduction, Donald John Trump. On that note, and without further ado, I'm truly pleased to be able to turn the podium over to a less controversial Wharton alum, Professor Geoffrey Stone. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I should make clear that I did not know Donald Trump, or more accurately, he did not know me when we were together at Wharton. But another fact about myself I'll add, which is perhaps more positive, is that when I was dean of the law school, I hired Barack Obama at the University of Chicago Law School. So I have different connections, not just the Trump one. So I am delighted to participate in this series. These are, I think, compelling and important issues that need real thought and consideration. And so I am honored to have the opportunity to put in my own 2 cents. Now, whenever I speak to students, I can't help but recall an incident involving Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. At the time of this particular incident, Holmes was a very old man, nearing 90 years of age, in the autumn of his very long and very distinguished career as a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, on this particular occasion, Holmes was on a train headed north from Washington, and he was deeply engrossed in reading a legal brief when the conductor knocked on the door to his compartment. Recognizing Holmes, the conductor respectfully asked for his ticket. Holmes looked in his coat pocket, no ticket. He looked in his vest pocket, no ticket. He reached into his trouser pocket, no ticket. Growing ever more frantic, Holmes began rummaging desperately through his briefcase, but still no ticket. At this point, the conductor, trying to calm Holmes, said, "Never mind, Mr. Justice, it's really not a problem. When you find the ticket, just mail it into the company." To which Holmes exploded, "You dolt, I don't give a damn about your ticket. I just want to know where the hell I'm supposed to be going." Well, as students, you must sometimes feel a bit like Justice Holmes. You want to know where the hell you're supposed to be going. And my task today is to offer at least some advice and direction. So I should like to begin by telling you a bit about my world. It is the world of the law. More specifically, it is the world of constitutional law. Now, law is about stories. It is about real people involved in real disputes with real consequences. So I shall tell you a story. This story begins during World War I. As you may or may not know, World War I was not a particularly popular war with the American people, whose sympathies were sharply divided. Many Americans vigorously opposed the Wilson administration's decision to intervene in the brutal conflict that was then raging in Europe, arguing that our intervention was both unwise and immoral. Not surprisingly, such opposition did not sit well with the government. In 1917, Attorney General Thomas Gregory, attacking the loyalty of war opponents, declared, quote, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from an avenging government." Gregory wasn't kidding about the avenging government. In 1918, Congress enacted the Sedition Act, which made it a crime for any person to utter, quote, "any disloyal, scurrilous, or abusive language intended to cause contempt for the government of the United States, the Constitution, the military, or the flag." True to the Attorney General's threat, federal authorities launched more than 2,000 prosecutions against individuals who wrote or spoke against the war or the draft. One such prosecution involved 5 young Russian Jewish immigrants who were roughly the age of college students at the time. In the summer of 1918, the United States sent a contingent of Marines to Vladivostok in Russia. Fearing that this was the first step of an American effort to crush the Russian Revolution, these 5 self-proclaimed socialists threw several thousand copies of each of 2 leaflets, one in English, the other in Yiddish, from several rooftops on the Lower East Side of New York City. The leaflets, which were boldly signed "The Rebels," were addressed to other Russian immigrants. After stating that the rebels hated German militarism, they warned those who worked in ammunition factories that they were, quote, "producing bullets, bayonets, and cannon to murder not only the Germans, but also your dearest, your best, who were in Russia and who were fighting for their freedom." The rebels were immediately arrested by the military police. And after a controversial trial, they were convicted of violating the Sedition Act of 1918, and the trial judge, disgusted by their behavior and their beliefs, sentenced the rebels to terms ranging up to 20 years in prison. The rebels appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court of the United States, claiming that the convictions violated the First Amendment, which guarantees that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. In Abrams versus United States, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, rejected this claim and upheld the convictions. For the majority of the court, this was an easy case. Because the natural tendency of the defendant's speech was to generate opposition to the war, it was not within the freedom of speech protected by the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the same Justice Holmes who some years later was to lose his railway ticket, dissented from the court's decision. Now, Holmes' dissenting opinion in Abrams is worth reading, for it remains one of the most eloquent statements ever written by a justice of the Supreme Court about the freedom of expression. Holmes wrote, quote, "Persecution for the expression of opinion seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally want to sweep away all opposition." But he added, "When men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which our wishes can safely be carried out." Holmes therefore concluded, quote, "that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression even of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten compelling government interests that an immediate check is necessary to save the nation." Now, I first read this passage, written almost a century ago, when I was a law student at the University of Chicago almost half a century ago. It has engaged my energy and curiosity ever since. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that it was my puzzling over this passage that, for better or worse, put me on the path to my career and indeed to where I stand before you today. today. But now I must change direction, for this is not to be a discourse on the First Amendment. It is rather to be a talk about academic freedom and free speech on campus. Happily, these are not unrelated subjects. To the contrary, the longer I have puzzled over the meaning of free expression, and the longer I've thought about education, the more the two seem to me to converge. Indeed, neither is really worth all that much without the other. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn to what I see as the intersection of free expression and education, and to the subject of academic freedom. For it's at this intersection that we will find the most fundamental values of the world of higher education. Now, I hope to accomplish two things in this part of my talk. First, I will trace briefly for you the history of academic freedom, for it's only by understanding where we have been that we can appreciate, in both senses of that word, where we are today. And second, I'll offer some thoughts about what all this means for you and about the responsibilities that we today bear in common. Now, it's important to understand that, like the freedom of speech, academic freedom is not a law of nature. It does not exist of its own force. It is always vulnerable and should never be taken for granted. Indeed, until well into the 19th century, real freedom of thought was neither practiced nor professed in American colleges. To the contrary, any real freedom of inquiry or expression in American colleges in this era was smothered by the dominance of religion and by the prevailing theory of doctrinal moralism, which assumed that the worth of an idea must be judged and determined by what the institution's leaders declared its moral value to be. Thus, through the first half of the 19th century, American colleges squelched any notion of free and open discussion or of intellectual curiosity. Any student or faculty member who dared argue, for example, that women were equal to men, that blacks were equal to whites, or that homosexuality was not immoral, would surely be expelled or fired without hesitation. Similarly, through the first half of the 19th century, as the nation moved towards civil war, any professor or student in the North who openly defended slavery, or any professor or student in the South who openly challenged slavery, could readily be dismissed, disciplined, or expelled. When a professor at the University of North Carolina expressed sympathy for the 1856 Republican presidential candidate, the students burned him in effigy, and he was dismissed by the Board of Trustees. When a professor at Franklin College in Pennsylvania admitted that he was not an abolitionist, he was promptly fired. Several decades later, a furious battle arose over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, with traditionalists charging not only that Darwin was wrong, but also that his beliefs were dangerous, immoral, and ungodly. As a consequence of this conflict in the academy over evolution versus creationism, new academic goals came to be embraced. For the first time, to criticize as well as to preserve traditional moral values and understandings became an accepted function of higher education. And by 1892, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, could boldly assert, when for any reason the administration of a university attempts to dislodge a professor or punish a student because of his political or religious sentiments, at that moment the institution has ceased to be a university. But despite such noble sentiments, the battle for academic freedom has been a continuing and fiercely contentious one. In the closing years of the 19th century, for example, businessmen who had accumulated vast industrial wealth began to support colleges and universities on an unprecedented scale. But that support was not without strings. And during this era, professors who offended wealthy donors by criticizing their business practices were dismissed from such leading institutions as Cornell and Stanford. Then, during World War I, patriotic zealots persecuted and, as we've seen, even criminally prosecuted those who questioned the wisdom or morality of the war. In the face of such outrage, universities collapsed almost completely in their defense of academic freedom. Students and professors were systematically expelled and fired at colleges and universities across the nation, merely for encouraging a spirit of indifference towards the war. Similar issues arose again with a vengeance during the Cold War, in the age of Joseph McCarthy. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, most colleges and universities excluded those even suspected of holding communist sympathies from university life. Yale President Charles Seymour, for example, went so far as to boast that, quote, "There will be no witch hunts at Yale because there will be no witches. We will neither admit nor hire anyone with communist sympathies." Now, as this history demonstrates, the freedom to question, the freedom to challenge, the freedom to inquire are not to be taken for granted. Academic freedom is, in fact, a hard-bought acquisition in an endless struggle to preserve the right of each individual, student and faculty alike, to seek wisdom, knowledge, and truth, free of the censor's sword. But what does this have to do with you? Well, in a radio address to America in 1931, the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw startled his audience with the following proposition. Every person, he said, who owes his life to civilized society and who has enjoyed its very costly protections and advantages should appear at reasonable intervals before a properly qualified jury to justify his existence, which should be summarily but painlessly terminated if he fails to justify it. Now, I don't advocate such a program, but I do suggest that every one of us who enjoys the protections and advantages of our hard-won system of academic freedom has a responsibility to justify her existence under it. There are several ways in which we can meet this responsibility. First, we must defend academic freedom when it comes under attack. Like every liberty that is precious to us, the preservation of academic freedom demands vigilance, determination, and sometimes courage. Second, we must struggle to define the meaning of academic freedom in our time. As we saw in the Abrams case, the Constitution's guarantee of freedom of speech is not self-defining. Neither is academic freedom. Each generation must give life to this concept in the face of the distinctive conflicts that arise over time. Today, the principal challenge to academic freedom comes not from outside the academy, but rather from within it, primarily from students themselves, some of whom demand censorship of ideas that they find distasteful and offensive, and from faculty members and university administrators who, afraid to disappoint their students, too often surrender academic freedom to charges of offense. And to give just a few examples of this phenomenon, several colleges and universities, including Johns Hopkins, Brown, and Williams, have recently withdrawn speaker invitations because of student objections to the views of the invited speakers. Northwestern University recently subjected a professor to a sustained sexual harassment investigation because she published an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education criticizing Northwestern's sexual harassment investigations. Colorado College suspended a student for making a joke that mocked feminism. The State University of New York denied promotion to a professor who criticized the university's affirmative action program. William & Mary and the University of Colorado disciplined students for criticizing their affirmative action programs. Students at Vanderbilt University demanded that a tenured professor be fired for writing an op-ed in which she raised questions about Islam and violence. The University of Kansas disciplined a professor for mocking the National Rifle Association. Louisiana State fired a professor because some of her women students complained that they'd been made to feel uncomfortable by her use of profanity in class. At Wesleyan University, after the school newspaper published a student op-ed criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement, students demanded that the university should defund the school paper. At Amherst College, students demanded that the administration remove posters stating "All Lives Matter." At Emory University, students demanded that other students who had shocked Trump in 2016 on the university sidewalks should be punished because, in their words, a university is supposed to be a safe place for students, and this made us feel unsafe. And at a number of institutions, including DePaul University, Claremont McKenna, the University of California at Irvine, San Francisco State, University of Pennsylvania, and Michigan State, students physically obstructed access to venues or shouted down speakers whose views they opposed, causing the events to be canceled. And to put all this in perspective, a recent survey revealed that 72% of current college students support disciplinary action against any student or faculty member who expresses views deemed by them to be racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise inappropriate. So where did all this come from? It was not long ago when students were demanding the right to free speech. Now, at least some students demand the right to be free from speech that they find to be offensive, upsetting, or emotionally disturbing. What explains this profound shift in attitude? So one often expressed theory is that at least some members of this generation of students have been raised by so-called helicopter parents who protected and celebrated them in every way, shielding them at every turn from the risks of failure, frustration, and defeat. On this theory, these students, unlike their predecessors, have never learned to deal effectively with challenge, uncertainty, insult, or fear. They therefore demand the right to be protected from speech that they find to be offensive, hurtful, or demeaning. If this is so, then the proper role of an institution of higher learning is not to shield these students from distressing and offensive ideas, but to prepare them for the challenges of the real world. The goal of a university should not be to insulate students from discomfort and insecurity, but to enable them to be strong and effective citizens of the world, a world that will not shield them from such expression. Now, another possible explanation of the current situation is that this generation of students is more attuned than their predecessors to the injustices of society, to the harmful impact of hateful expression, and to the inequalities that poison our nation. To the extent this is so, it might be in part a response to the creation of social media. When I was a student or growing up, people like me were rarely exposed to hateful expression. The media never carried it, and although we knew it existed, we rarely confronted it, except occasionally perhaps in a locker room. The world of social media has changed that. Today, it is difficult not to encounter hateful expression. And on this view of the matter, students today are not timid, but bold. They seek not shelter, but justice. They understand the ugliness of such expression, and they want to protect both themselves and their classmates from the vitriol that now poisons some forms of expression. Still, another possible explanation is that some students, particularly those who come from disadvantaged, marginalized, and discriminated against backgrounds, have always felt unwelcome and alienated on college campuses, but in the past they simply remained silent. On this view of the matter, this generation of college students, particularly those who themselves feel unwelcome and marginalized, deserve credit, because instead of remaining silent in the face of that oppression, they have the courage and the integrity to demand equality and respect. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that there is an element of truth in all of these perspectives. The question, though, is what to do about it. Faced with the ongoing challenge to academic freedom at American universities, in 2014, University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer charged a faculty committee with the task of drafting a formal statement for our university on the freedom of expression. The goal of that committee, which I chaired, was to stake out our university's position on these issues. The committee consisted of 7 distinguished faculty members from across the university, and after broad consultation, we produced a brief 3-page report. And at the risk of being self-indulgent, I want to read you some excerpts from the report. Because the University of Chicago is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees all members of our community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. Except insofar as limitations on that freedom are necessary to the functioning of the University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of our community to discuss any problems that present themselves. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict. But it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions that they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of the community. The freedom to debate and to discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, wherever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the core functioning of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression. And it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even most members of the community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective, courageous, and responsible manner is an essential part of our university's educational mission. As a corollary to the university's commitment to protect and promote free expression, members of the university community must also act in conformity with the principle of free expression. Although members of the university community are free to criticize and contest the views expressed on campus, and to criticize and contest speakers who are invited to express their views on campus, they may not obstruct or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views that they reject or loathe. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it." End quote. Now, interestingly, when we wrote this report, we were thinking only about the University of Chicago. It was a report about and for our institution. And indeed, the first 5 paragraphs of the report talk in detail about various incidents that had occurred in our own history and how the University of Chicago dealt with them. To our surprise, the report has had a national and even international impact. People at other universities figured out they could just lop off the first 5 paragraphs about the University of Chicago and adopt the rest of the report as their own. And indeed, that report has now been more or less adopted by some 35 colleges and universities across the nation, including such diverse institutions as Princeton, Columbia, the University of Minnesota, the University of Missouri, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, American University, and the University of Wisconsin, to name just a few. Okay, so now that I've finished congratulating myself, let me elaborate a bit. Why should a university take the position that faculty and students should be free to advance any and all ideas, however offensive, obnoxious, and wrong-headed they might be? First, one thing we have learned from bitter experience is that even the ideas that we hold to be certain might in fact turn out to be wrong. As confident as we might be in our own wisdom, experience teaches that certainty is different from truth. If those who believed with absolute certainty that Earth was the center of the universe were wrong, if those who believed with absolute certainty in creationism were wrong, if those who believed that slavery was natural, right, and proper were wrong, if those who believed that a woman's place is in the home were wrong, if those who believed that homosexuals were degraded perverts were wrong, then why should we have the arrogance to think that we are unquestionably right about our own beliefs today? The only wise approach, as Justice Holmes made clear, is always to acknowledge the risk that our certainties might be wrong as well, and that they too must always be open to challenge and to question. Second, experience teaches that the suppression of speech breeds the suppression of speech. If today I am permitted to silence those whose views I find distasteful, I have then opened the door to allow others down the road to silence me. The neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. And this is especially important in the current situation, for in the long run, it is likely to be minorities, whether religious minorities, racial minorities, or political minorities. Really? Oh. Yeah, the neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. This is especially important in the current situation, for in the long run, it is likely to be minorities, whether religious minorities, racial minorities, or political minorities, who are most likely to be silenced once censorship is deemed acceptable. Indeed, without a vibrant commitment to freedom of speech, our nation would never have seen a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, or a gay rights movement, all of which would have been suppressed by intolerant majorities. Censorship is never a one-way street, and this is a door we do not want to open, perhaps especially in the era of Trump. Indeed, it is important to remember that a robust protection of free speech is especially important to dissenters and to minority groups, because if censorship is permitted, it is ultimately they who will suffer the most. Third, a central precept of free expression is the concern with the chilling effect. That problem is especially acute today because of the effects of social media. It used to be the case that students and faculty members were willing to take controversial positions, in part because the risks of doing so were relatively modest. One could say something provocative or outrageous, and the statement soon disappeared from view. But in the world of social media, where every comment one makes can be circulated to the world and can be called up later by prospective employers or graduate schools or neighbors or dates with the mere click of a button, the potential cost of speaking courageously, of taking controversial positions, of taking risks, is greater now than ever before in history. According to a recent survey, 65% of all college students today say that it is unsafe for them to express unpopular views. And this clearly has had an effect on faculty as well. In this setting, it is especially important for institutions of higher learning to stand up for free expression. So how should all of this work in practice? Should students, faculty, and other speakers be allowed to express whatever views they want, however offensive they might be? Yes, absolutely. Should those who disagree and are offended by the views and speech of others be allowed to condemn those views and those speakers in the most vehement terms? Yes, absolutely. Should students, faculty, and community members who oppose a speaker be permitted to disrupt an event in order to prevent that individual from speaking? Absolutely not. Although non-disruptive protests are both permitted and encouraged, disruption of the rights of others to speak and to listen is wholly incompatible with the central principle of academic freedom. Should those who are offended and who disagree with the views of others be allowed to demand that the institution punish those who have offended them? Yes, absolutely. Should a university punish those whose speech annoys, offends, and insults others? Absolutely not. But what, though, should a university do? First, a university should educate its students and faculty about the importance of civility and of mutual respect. As a former student wrote to me recently, a university has an obligation to create a community of people as well as a community of ideas, a place where everyone feels certain that they are unambiguously welcomed. This must be a core institutional value, but it is a value that must be reinforced and reaffirmed by education and by example, not by censorship. Second, a university should encourage free, open, and robust disagreement, argument, and debate. It should educate its students about the history, the importance, and fragility of free speech. And it should instill in its students and faculty the importance of winning the day by facts, by ideas, and by persuasion, rather than by force, disruption, or censorship. Indeed, for an institution of higher education to fulfill its most fundamental mission, it must be a safe space for even the most loathsome, offensive, and disloyal arguments. As a former colleague of mine at the University of Chicago Law School, who stepped down last year as President of the United States, observed in a recent commencement address, quote, "No matter how much you might disagree with certain speakers, don't try to shut them down. Let them talk, but have the confidence to challenge them. If the other side has a point, learn from them. If they're wrong, rebut them. Beat them on the battlefield of ideas. And you might as well start practicing now, because one thing I can guarantee you, you will have to deal with ignorance, hatred, racism, and stupidity at every stage of your life." Third, a university must recognize that our society being flawed as it is, the cost of free speech will often fall most heavily on those groups and individuals who feel the most marginalized, unwelcome, and disrespected. All of us feel that way sometimes, but in our often unjust society, the individuals who most often bear the brunt of free speech, or at least of certain types of free speech, tend to be racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, gays, lesbians, transsexuals, immigrants, ideological dissidents, and the like. Colleges and universities must be sensitive to this reality. Even if they cannot solve this problem by censorship, they can and should take other steps to address the special challenges faced by groups and individuals who are most often made to feel unwelcome and unvalued by others. Institutions of higher learning must take this challenge seriously. They should encourage civility and mutual respect. They should support students who feel vulnerable, marginalized, silenced, and demeaned. They should help those students learn how to speak up, how to respond effectively, how to challenge those whose attitudes, whose words, and whose beliefs offend, appall, and outrage them. This is a core responsibility of our institutions, for the world is not a safe space, and it is our job to enable our graduates to win the battles that they will need to fight in the years and the decades to come. This is not a challenge that universities can or should ignore. Speaking of the responsibility of colleges and universities, I should address one other critical facet of these issues. Suppose those who oppose the speaker, whether they be students, faculty, or community members, disregard their responsibility to respect the freedom of speech and threaten violence or otherwise disrupt an event in order to prevent an invited speaker from speaking. What should the institution do? After the events of Charlottesville and other places, this is a particularly important and challenging question. The simple solution is for the institution to play it safe and to just refuse to permit the speaker to come to campus. Indeed, this is the approach several institutions have adopted. The University of Florida and Texas A&M, for example, announced that they would not permit alt-right speaker Richard Spencer to speak on campus for fear of disruption and even violence. But if universities adopt this approach and thus empower those who oppose the speaker to prevent the event from taking place by threatening violence and disruption, what will happen? Such a response will inevitably encourage others who want to exclude speakers to adopt the same strategy, knowing that they too can shut down speech that they oppose merely by threatening violence and disruption. This invites what the Supreme Court has termed the heckler's veto. Such a course invites other groups to wield the power of censorship over whatever views they wish to suppress, whether those views be anti-war, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-immigration, pro-Israel, anti-Trump, pro-abortion, anti-affirmative action, pro-gay rights, or whatever. In effect, the heckler's veto turns the right to free speech over to those who oppose the ideas being expressed. Now, it's noteworthy, by the way, that the Supreme Court first learned this lesson during the Civil Rights era, when white Southerners threatened violence in order to shut down civil rights marches. What the court concluded is that the responsibility of the city, the police, or the university in such circumstances is to take all reasonable measures to protect the speaker and to enable the event to take place, and that it can terminate the event only if it is impossible for it to prevent a clear and present danger of serious harm. Short of that, though, the heckler's veto cannot prevail. Now, I should make one other important point about the strategy of disruption. It is counterproductive. What it does is to give the speaker and her ideas greater visibility, turns her into a martyr, and enables her to sell books, get on cable news, and promote her views more effectively than ever. People like Richard Spencer and Coulter in Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, were complete unknowns until they were made famous by violent protests against their views. Now they are household names and ever more sought-after speakers. As the Southern Poverty Law Center recently explained in a policy statement on the alt-right on campus, quote, when an alt-right personality is scheduled to speak on campus, the most effective course of action is to deny the speaker the thing he or she wants most, a spectacle. Alt-right personalities know that their cause is helped by news footage of large jeering crowds, heated confrontations, and outright violence at their events. It allows them to play the victim and gives them a larger platform for their racist message. Denying an alt-right speaker of such a spectacle is the worst insult they can endure. What the Southern Poverty Law Center wisely recommends instead is that the best strategy for those who oppose the speaker's view is to hold an alternative event away from the alt-right event to highlight the campus's commitment to inclusion and to the nation's democratic values. This response is the right one across the boards, whether the speaker is a member of the alt-right, an opponent of gay rights, a supporter of abortion rights, or any other speaker whose views one opposes. So let me now return to my central theme. What is it that makes for a great educational institution? It is, I submit, the intense, strenuous, and constant intellectual activity of the place. Presented with many points of view, students must be compelled to learn how to think for themselves. At a great educational institution, the air is electric with ideas and with questions. And it is from that environment that students derive an intellectual stimulation that should last them the rest of their lives. This is the true meaning of education. Your responsibility as a student is to test what you were taught at every turn, to challenge your teachers, your classmates, and yourselves, to choose your own values and your own beliefs. To meet this responsibility, you will have to be independent, you will have to be daring, you will have to take risks. It is not easy to tell your professor, who has devoted years, perhaps decades, to mastering her subject, that you disagree with her latest observation or theory. But the discourse of a great institution of learning should be an incitement to risk and to boldness. If you find yourself hesitating, if you feel timid, if you wonder if it's worth it, think of the rebels in Abrams. At an age not much older than you, they dared to take on the government of the United States. You certainly can take on your professor. The faculty of a great institution of higher learning ask nothing of you that they do not also ask of themselves. Even the most distinguished teacher and scholar routinely suffers frustration and failure. It's only by taking risks, by daring to ask questions no one else has ever asked, that real contributions are achieved. Thus, if your professors ask you to take risks, know that they take risks as well. At an institution like the University of Wisconsin, you should never forget that the only appropriate response to even the most withering question is not resentment, but gratitude. Fulfilling the responsibility of academic freedom means more than challenging your classmates and your teachers. It also means challenging yourself. It means being willing to reconsider what you yourself have come to accept as true. In 1921, after 2 years in prison in the United States, Molly Steimer, one of the Abrams rebels, was deported to the Soviet Union. It was not what she expected. Disappointed in the political and economic system that she found there, Steimer again agitated against the government, this time against the Soviet government. Again, she was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of sedition. In 1923, she was deported from the Soviet Union. I don't know this for sure, but I rather suspect this was an unparalleled achievement. To be convicted of sedition and deported within 5 years from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Whatever else you might think of her, Molly Steimer was not afraid to reconsider her positions. In 1919, a majority of the Supreme Court in the Abrams case rejected the bold approach of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and opted for a safe view of the First Amendment. 50 years later, the Supreme Court unanimously overruled the majority opinion in Abrams, and embracing Justice Holmes' dissenting opinion in that case, held that the government may not punish even speech that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless the speech is both intended and likely to incite imminent lawless action. To reach this result, the court had to challenge the first principles of its predecessors and to overturn half a century of precedent. A great university, like a successful court, must dedicate itself to the rigorous, open-minded, unyielding search for truth. You will learn here to ask the hard questions, but it is not enough to examine the premises, beliefs, and assumptions of an earlier time and find them wanting. It is too easy to dismiss those who thought that the earth was the center of the universe, that its resources were boundless, that only men should vote, that marriage is only for people of the opposite sex, or that separate could ever be equal. You must remember that you too hold beliefs that your children or your children's children will rightly regard as naive, foolish, and perhaps even obscene. You must be prepared to challenge your beliefs, to reform your world, just as the rebels in Abrams struggled to reform theirs. You too must challenge the nature of things. So to return to the question with which I began, where the hell are you supposed to be going? As you've no doubt surmised, your adventure has no predetermined path, no assigned destination. Let the journey engage you. For as the humorist Will Rogers observed almost a century ago, even if you were on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. At an institution like Wisconsin, the faculty warmly welcome their students because students are where the future lies. From this place, you will take away an intellectual stimulation and curiosity that will last you the rest of your days. As Justice Holmes mused in Abrams, all life is an experiment. May your life's experiment be filled with curiosity, boldness, and courage. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll have questions now?
Yeah. So we'll
Holy cow.
Professor, thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today. But I would like clarification. You've talked about academic freedom almost always in reference to faculty. To what extent do students have academic freedom on our campuses?
When it comes to freedom of speech in public discourse, they have the exact same academic freedom as faculty. Inside classrooms, there's obviously a different context for both faculty and students, because that's a more ordered environment. But in terms of public discourse, speakers and the like, the academic freedom of students is exactly the same as faculty.
Well, thank you for your talk, and at the risk of being boring, I agreed with every word that you uttered. However, I do have a comment, perhaps a question, and that is that it seems as though there is a more serious challenge to free speech than the ones that you enumerated in your talk, and those challenges come from the power of the purse. So I've been the beneficiary, at least once, from our administration here, of being protected from my right to exercise my free speech, and from a quarter that was not unpowerful, and I greatly appreciate that. However, currently, we have a budget model which actually privileges the STEM areas and the professions, and that in turn sees the humanities and the social sciences receiving cuts. Now, we also have had figures like Bill Simon, formerly the head of the Department of Treasury in the 1970s, later went on to the Olin Foundation, et cetera, who argued that the way to deal with speech that you didn't like was to turn the funding spigot off on them. And he argued that this was precisely what needed to be done in the 1970s, and then we saw the creation of an infrastructure to do just that with private foundations. So what do you say to that? I mean, what is our responsibility to fund those areas from which often critical remarks and emerge from, the humanities and the social sciences, which are seeing really, really significant cuts here right now?
So the question is to some degree different depending on whether you're talking about a public or a private institution. So at a private institution, the university should never accept gifts that require the recipients of the gifts to endorse particular positions. That's just illegitimate. And that's sort of what I referred to back in the late 19th century with wealthy donors who basically were trying to manipulate what faculty could study, what positions they could advance, what arguments they could embrace, what they could teach. Private universities should never accept a gift with those conditions, no matter how much it's for, never. Simple. That's number one. Public universities is more complicated because they are part of the state. And it's complicated in two ways. First is that you have an owner, the state, right? It's different from the relationship between private universities, which don't have an owner except themselves, right? And the question then is, what is the appropriate relationship between the state and the public university, right? On the one hand, the state can take the view that we own you and we can tell you what to do and what not to do. On the other hand, public universities and the states are subject to the First Amendment, which private universities are not. The Constitution only governs government, not private entities. So the question then is, what state governments can constitutionally do in constraining and dictating what happens at a public university? So if a state government, for example, takes the view that certain positions cannot be advocated or taught in a public university, that would clearly, in my view, violate the First Amendment. And it would be an open and shut case if you could prove that that was what was happening, that was going on. In terms of subject matters, fields, that's a little more complicated. So the public university can make judgment, the state legislature can make judgments within its power that the university should focus on certain goals in the educational process in terms of producing graduates who will be expert in certain areas rather than other areas, if the reason for doing so is not to distort the discourse on the campus in terms of ideas, but in terms of making the universities more functional for the goals of the state as a whole. And as long as those do not get into ideological manipulation, but get into judgments about what best serves the state in terms of what kind of graduates we need to staff our businesses and so on. Those are more complicated questions. But one of the things I think that state legislatures should be very cautious about is interfering carelessly in the autonomy of public institutions of learning. That there is a degree of expertise, of independence that the leaders and the faculty and the staff of a university have that should be particularly respected by political figures. And that to the extent they fail to do that, they may or may not be violating the First Amendment, but they are clearly violating what I would regard to be their responsibilities to ensure that the people who know best about education and scholarship are the ones making those decisions. So it's not as if they can never make judgments, but I think they have to do so with a high degree of respect for the positions that are advocated by the people who know most about what's going on and about what the goals of education should be. So that would be my response to that.
So I think people will disagree about certain ideas, but I think most reasonable people will agree that while maybe I shouldn't be able to say that idea bothers me, don't say it, I should be free to not be subjected to threats of violence. Right? I think most people would find that reasonable, that you can't go around threatening other people with physical violence. And, you know, with this idea of this free marketplace of ideas, with something like the one example you brought up was Milo Yiannopoulos. When he came to this campus, because of his actions, a student was threatened with physical violence. People were emailing, calling, looking up this student on social media, and she was getting death threats and rape threats because of what Milo Yiannopoulos did. The administration knew full well this would be the consequences of Milo coming to the campus because we told them that was what was going to happen. So when this freedom of speech spills over into the place where people are being threatened with violence or possibly actually being the subjects of violence, as we've seen in the last few years, do the same rules still apply? Do they still get to come here and say, yeah, let's just kill all of those people because we don't like them? That would be my question.
So a threat in the law is what's called a true threat. And what it means is a statement by a person directed to another person that is intended to threaten them with harm caused by the person who's speaking. So if I say to you, if you don't give me $1,000, I'm going to kill you, I can go to jail, right? And a student who says that to another student, or a speaker who says that specifically and credibly to a student in the audience could be punished for threatening, right? But you can't broaden the definition to speech that makes other people feel uncomfortable, to speech that might cause other people to make threats. Then you punish the person who makes the threats, right? If go back to Abrams, right? They were criticizing the sending of troops to Russia. They were criticizing the war. The government's argument was, what that's going to do is to cause people to refuse induction into the military, and it's going to cause people to turn against the war, and that's a natural consequence of your criticizing the war. And that's precisely what was wrong, to take that leap, right? You can punish people for what they themselves do or say that's criminal, but not because their speech may cause other people to get angry and then to do something itself that's criminal. So if I give a speech criticizing the war, and you then turn against the war and refuse induction, you can be punished for refusing induction. But I can't be punished for criticizing the war. That's the key principle that the court failed to recognize in Abrams, but it's come to recognize since. And the same thing is true in a university context. So if Milo Yiannopoulos credibly says to a student in the audience, because you said that, I'm going to kill you, that would be a threat, and he could be criminally prosecuted for that. But if he's simply saying things that angers people, which leads them to behave in that way, the people who behave in that way can be punished, but the speaker can't. It's fine with me, yeah.
So I would just say it'd be one thing if this was isolated, but if there is a pattern of behavior from a person to go on stage at a university, name a person, and then that person gets a bunch of death threats from a whole bunch of people, and then they keep doing that at different universities, at what point are they party to that crime of threatening those people?
unless you can show that they are themselves making the threat, they're not. In the same way that you go out, you give speeches and you criticize the war, and people refuse induction, or they refuse to buy war bonds, or they desert the military. Even though you're condemning the war and you're getting everybody angry against the war, the key principle was that you can't punish the person who's making that speech unless they themselves are engaging in a threat. The point is that you hold the people responsible who are doing the illegal thing, not the speaker who changes their attitudes and they therefore do illegal things. Otherwise, you can't criticize the government. I mean, to take it to that point, that's exactly how it turns out. That was the lesson of Abrams, is you can't do that, and the same thing applies in your situation.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. I enjoyed your talk. I want to see if we can historicize a little bit. I'm a historian. And in terms of the young man's questions, I wonder, just to comment on that, and then I actually have my own question, I wonder if in an era of social media, it's important to think about something that some colleagues of mine writing for the Journal of Academic Freedom describe as a virtual mob. With the Yiannopoulos case, putting up a slide of a person demeaning her and urging others to do the same.
Tell me more. I don't know what happened. Tell me more about
I'm telling you what happened.
He put up a slide of a student?
Of a student.
And why that student?
He singled her out for harassment because he felt because she was transgender, and he felt that was disgusting.
So he took a student who is transgender and put up her
slide of her
and her identity.
Yes.
And what did he say should happen to her?
I wasn't there.
Okay, so that matters. You see, in this.
What did he say?
Well, first of all, he repeatedly misgendered her on purpose. He repeatedly misgendered her on purpose and specifically pulled up a photo of her from before she had started actively presenting as female and said, you want to know how ugly he is? Or no, what was it? You want to know how bad he is at passing? I'd still fuck him. Because, of course, Milo identifies as gay. Perhaps you're unaware of a phenomenon called doxing.
No, I am.
Okay. That is what Milo did. He took a student's private information and put it out there for the express purpose of exposing that student to violence.
So
Milo.
let me interrupt there. One of the things I said in the talk, and as part of the report that we wrote, is that speech that invades privacy is actionable. So if what he did was to take a private individual and reveal publicly something that would have been understood to be private about her, that's totally separate from threatening. That's a separate crime that could be actionable.
Okay, so he's done this. To go back to what a previous student had said, Milo had done this on numerous occasions at other events, at other universities, and it's a demonstrable pattern of violence. And say what you want about invasion of privacy is different from violence. No, it's not. Invasion of privacy is violence, especially when the purpose of that invasion...
I got to tell you, you're using words now very carelessly, in a way that is not appropriate. Invasion of privacy is invasion of privacy. It is not violence. You're using the word violence now in a way that makes it meaningless.
When the purpose of the invasion of privacy is to do violence, that invasion of privacy itself becomes violent.
What was the violence?
The rape threats.
That's a threat.
The death
even
threats.
that's not violence. Violence has meaning, right? That's a threat. The threat's illegal. But don't throw the word violence around in a way that doesn't have any meaning. All you're saying is anything that I don't like is violent.
No, that is not what I'm saying. So don't put
Well, then I
meaningless
don't know what
words
you
to the
mean by
words
the
that
word
I'm
violent.
saying. There is a tendency for people to assume that we don't want to hear things that we find offensive. But what we're actually saying is we have a right not to be threatened.
Yes.
Threats against our right to live, our right to exist, against our right to an education, against our right to speech.
But you have to understand what a threat is. A threat is not just something that make other people do something you don't want. That's not a threat. A threat is, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to kill you. The doxers may be making threats. Right? Those may be real threats that could be punished.
So can I take the moderator's right?
Yeah.
Just to say
Please.
that what we have in a sense is what Geoffrey called a different, which is Professor Stone is talking from a legal perspective. I think what he's saying seems, as far as my understanding of the law is correct. I think you're talking about a more ethical question. I think both of you, what you're asking really, and I agree with you, is whether Milo should have been invited or should have been permitted to speak. That's a different question, I think, from the legal question of whether what he did was violence or not, which, you know.
So my view is Milo, who I do not agree with in any way, whoever invited him from campus had a right to do so.
But wait, this actually relates to the question I was initially going to ask.
Okay.
So just to historicize, what we're confronted with now is an incredibly well-funded, deeply well-planned assault on the university, the public university's right to exist in terms of public academic freedom and freedom of speech. When that money comes on campus and creates a student group that then files the paperwork to invite Yiannopoulos, are we really talking about freedom of speech? Can we historicize that a little? Because that feels like buying something to me. And that's what we witnessed here. That's what we are witnessing. That's what we're witnessing at Stevens Point, you know, where several departments are being closed for what are being expressed as economic exigency, but are really part of a very long, I'm talking since the 1950s, assault on public higher education as a part of an assault, as documented by historian Nancy McLean, on democracy as we know it. So if I seem a little desperate and passionate, I am. So is it the same thing as Abrams?
No, but
it's hard for me.
you're talking about a totally different problem.
I am,
Right.
exactly.
That's
So
a
let's
totally different
historicize
question.
and
So
say the
you're-
freedom of speech of the people who brought Yiannopoulos here was purchased. So is that freedom of speech?
So it depends what you mean by purchase, by whom, and how.
Turning Point created a group here in October of the year they brought Yiannopoulos in December. That group filed papers to be a student group. There were 2 or 3 students on campus, funded by outside funding and adults who were not students. So the university administration was in this difficult place where they said it's a student org, right? But it's a student org that was purchased by vast, deeply pocketed people who hate what we do here.
So lots of student organizations get funding, not only from the institution, but from outside sources. The American Constitution Society, the American Civil Liberties Union, they get funding from outside, from those organizations, in addition to the inside organizations. If we want to ban all student organizations from ever receiving any funds from any outside organizations, one could do that. But the fact is that's not the rule most universities I'm aware of follow, and that at least within certain limits of dollars, they allow student organizations to get additional funds from outside supporters, and then they allow the student organizations to exercise their authority within the university. So from that standpoint, I think there's a danger that you're pointing to, right? There's a danger that outside entities begin to manipulate in a way that's problematic, and the way to address that is to put limits on how much, and that's what the University of Chicago does, for example. Student groups can get outside funding, but only up to a certain amount. And that keeps it within reasonable bounds. But you know, to say no outside money means you got a problem in the other direction, because then there's not enough money for students to do the kind of things you want them to be able to do. On the other hand, to allow limitless money in this way, I would say is bad policy, and I would just change the policy.
Thank you.
And for and I assume it's not government doing this, but a private foundation or some sort. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Could you comment on a situation that I think came up within the last year or two, and I believe it was at a public university in Florida, where the economics department accepted money from a fairly conservative outside group with strings attached in terms of who they wanted to be part of the interview process for the faculty members that would receive funding.
It was Koch Foundation.
Yes. Could you comment on I think that's a rather risky situation for a university to put itself in. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
As I said earlier, I think universities should never allow that, period, regardless of who the donor is. I mean, when you take money from a donor, it should be to support an intellectual or other activity that is in the university's interest, but does not have any strings attached that interfere with academic freedom. And that means sometimes you have to turn down gifts. Oftentimes you can negotiate common ground that work pretty well, but sometimes you just say no. And that's the responsibility of the university, to say no. Otherwise, you're not a university. As William Rainey Harper said a century ago, you're not a university if you do that. You're just a business that is no longer committed to any kind of academic freedom, and you shouldn't be allowed to have students. And the Koch brothers, by the way, have tried to do that around the country in many ways, and it's disgraceful, to be honest. It's utterly disgraceful.
Hi, I'm Morgan. I'm a student, and I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate the legal perspective, because I do think that sometimes that's lost in these discussions. What's legal and what is ethical is not always the same. I guess what I struggle with is, we're in an era, let's focus on the present moment, where we don't have debates about whether we should go to war, whether we should have a draft, right? We're talking about people such as Richard Spencer and the neo-Nazis who believe that women should not control their bodies, who believe that people of color are second-class citizens, who want to build that wall, who have no problem separating families via ICE, and all these other issues that we see. So how can we maintain on campuses a place that is safe and because bringing in Charles Murray, who tried at where was that, in Vermont?
Middlebury.
Right. Someone who tries to use biology and science to show that people who are of African descent are inferior, to bring someone like that to a college campus, what does that say about the students, his research, bringing Milo to a campus, any campus, all the other stuff aside? I wasn't here for that. But who doesn't believe that people who are transgender are actually people? We're not talking about policy differences. We're not talking about, whether we should have a flat tax or some of these other policy debates we've had in the last 50 years. We're talking about people who do not believe other people are actually fully human. So what are the legal... What's your comment on that, I guess?
So first of all, the use of the terms I used were not meant to be legal. They were meant to be accurate, careful, precise, regardless of whether it's technically legal or not. Precision is important if you want to have consistency and if you want to have people understand what's permitted and what's not permitted, and you don't want to have ever-expanding and ambiguous definitions of things, which then can be used and will be used to manipulate in ways that will come back and bite you. That's the key part for wanting precision. Number two, though, I think, I'm sorry, repeat the last part of your question again?
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, what do we do? We're not bringing Jane Fonda to campus, right? We're bringing someone to campus or
People
campuses.
thought Jane Fonda was every bit as awful as now they think Milo
Okay, yeah,
was,
she's
for
not a
different
great
reasons.
example.
Yes,
Well,
they did.
She
Yes, they
did
did.
not. I guess I would disagree. She didn't view.
You would disagree, but other people...
She did not view.
You're not my boss.
You-
If I want to hear Jane Fonda, I can. If I want to hear Milo, I can. If I want to hear Charles Murray, I can.
Well, but we're talking.
You don't have to go,
But
and you can
that's,
protest
I
it.
guess, sort of the heart of my question is: we've got people who view on policy. We've got people who view on I like tea and you like coffee. Milo or Richard Spencer, the alt-right. They do not view people who are transgender as people. They do not view people who are biracial as full humans. They do not view me as a woman as a full person. They want to control, via money and via education, and they want to build the wall, and they want to support ICE, and they want to. So we're talking about different levels here of
You're
offensiveness.
just deciding that certain things you believe in are absolutely sacrosanct and cannot be challenged. Other people believe different things. During the communist era, you sitting there would be saying exactly the same thing about communists.
Right, but we're talking about people's ability to be considered a person, which is different than saying I'm Hanoi Jane or whatever Jane Fonda did 50 years ago, right? There's a difference there, and I kind of hope that you're just engaging me in an intellectual debate and that you can see...
I don't disagree with you on the policy.
Okay.
About what I think. I mean, my views are largely similar to yours on the merits, but where I disagree with you is I think I don't want myself or you or the president of my university or your state legislature telling us who we can have speak.
Oh, I absolutely believe
That's
that our
what it comes
elected
down to.
officials and the people that he appoints should not be in that business.
You
but
want Donald Trump deciding who can speak and who
oh
can't?
God, no. All right,
That's
I'm
the
gonna
problem.
I'm gonna cede my
No, but you have to
microphone. I'm
understand-
clutching it, but I will
No,
cede.
but it's important to get the key problem. You want to be able to censor the views that you think are repulsive and repugnant and ignorant and the like. And I understand why you want to do that. As Holmes said, that's human nature. But the problem is you won't be the one to make those decisions in the long run. Donald Trump will, not you. And your state legislature will, not you. And you really want to legitimate that. The point about protecting academic freedom or free speech is I don't want anyone else deciding what I can say because I don't trust them. And particularly for minorities to be taking this position is deadly. What they are doing is inviting their own repression. That's the point. Not that I disagree with you on the merits, but I think that opening the door to that is exactly the wrong thing. As I said in the talk, we would not have had a civil rights movement. We would not have had a gay rights movement. We would not have had a women's rights movement if people in the majority could have said, those ideas are horrendous, they're offensive, they're absurd, they're completely distorting of reality. You today disagree with them. Many people like you agreed with them 50 years ago, 75 years ago. You don't want to shut those ideas off just because most people find them offensive and stupid. Because sometimes they're right, even if they're stupid. And you think these ideas are wrong, I think these ideas are wrong, but I don't want to give anybody else the power to tell me what I can say. That's what it comes down to.
Thank you. Dr. Stone, I really appreciated your talk. And in general, I have to say I agree with just about everything you say. But I noticed you used the word precision. And here I'll just bring to your attention that engineers use precision and then there's accuracy. Precision is the ability to constantly reproduce a result. Accuracy is when the result is right. So is there no place here where we can say what you're saying is not true?
You can say it anytime you want.
Okay. So in that case then, we have to allow people to come onto our campus and say lies.
So what you think is a lie.
Well, no, let me go back to what you said earlier. You went through a long list of...
Homosexuality is normal. It's natural. It's something we should respect. 30 years ago, lie. Abortion should be legal. It's a right of a woman. 75 years ago, lie.
Okay, earlier in your speech, you went through a list of things that you said you were making a distinction here between certainty and truth. And you said, well, at one point we thought that women were not equal to men, and we were certain of that.
Mm-hmm. Now we don't, although most of us don't.
Okay, so really there is no truth in saying whether that really has no bearing on this whatsoever.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
So
I mean, there are some factual things, but in the realm of the kinds of issues we're talking about, there is no truth about abortion is good or bad, or homosexuality is healthy or not healthy for the psychology of the person. People disagree about this.
Okay,
They can talk about it. They
here
can argue about
I guess I'm trying to draw it back to what was said before about humanity. So really, there is no truth of humanity.
I have my beliefs, and you have your beliefs, but we don't necessarily have truth.
Okay, and then I guess I'm going to wonder. So, I went to graduate school during a time when the right wing was attacking the university over the relativity of truth. And they told me that, one of the things that I was doing wrong was I was a damn postmodernist, and postmodernists are fascists. So I guess I'm wondering then, how does truth fit into this at all? I mean, or does it? I mean, really, it sounds like what you're telling me here is that I can make any claim, a speaker can make any claim they want, and we can't interfere with their ability to spread what is clearly not true.
Right. What Holmes accurately said is the thing to do is to respond, and we don't rely on a dictator, whether you're the dictator or I'm the dictator, or your governor's the dictator or the president's the dictator, to decide what truth is. That's what we cannot trust. So the answer is, rather than trust that, we fight it out. We argue about it. We try to persuade each other. We come to agreement. It's not perfect, but it's better than having a godlike figure who determines what truth is. That's the problem. That's the challenge.
So I want to shift this, the grounds of this discussion a bit, because I think we're not making a lot of progress. And I want to shift to the, well, good, maybe we are. Anybody, but I want to just shift to a different question, which is partly, I think, what is behind some of these questions from students and faculty here, and especially regarding the invitation of someone like Milo or Richard Spencer. And the question is, are there other grounds? You, in your lecture, you think sort of almost identify freedom of speech and academic freedom. And I guess I want to put some distance and space between them. The academy is a place of evaluation, first and foremost. We evaluate our students evaluate us, we evaluate our colleagues, we evaluate our superiors, and so forth. We're always evaluating people. We're evaluating them not on the basis of whether we agree with them, but on the basis of something like the quality of their work. And the quality of their work has to do with how the work reflects certain kinds of expected standards, what kinds of grounds one gives, what the norms of logical and reasoned debate are. So when you said, which I might be willing to agree with you, we shouldn't have the heckler's threat. We shouldn't not let somebody speak because we're threatened, because I understand that can be turned around both ways. Can a university administrator, on good grounds, deny the right to host a speech because the speech, in evaluating the speech, let's say having a faculty committee evaluating whether this meets the standards of academic discourse? So in other words, can there be grounds that aren't based on the content of speech and aren't based on beliefs, but are based on the form of argument, analysis, and so forth?
So obviously universities operate in realms like grading papers and hiring faculty and giving tenure, where they are evaluating the quality of the work of the individuals, and that's bound up with the quality of argument and the quality of ideas and so on, and that's unavoidable. You're not going to give out faculty positions randomly by picking them out of a hat. So that's essential to the core functioning of the university, right? In public discourse, the presumption is that we should be open to hearing all sorts of ideas and arguments, regardless of whether we think they're good or bad, because maybe we're wrong, right? Now, you could imagine a situation, so universities do exactly this a lot of the time. When the university invites speakers, when they invite a convocation speaker, for example, they're making judgments about whether they think this is a good, appropriate speaker for the institution, and they make those judgments, right? When faculty programs invite speakers, the faculty members presumably take into account whether they think the speaker is making a useful contribution, and that's perfectly fine so far as they're doing that, right? And indeed, student organizations, when they invite speakers, are in their own way doing the same thing, or at least presumptively doing the same thing, of inviting people whose views they want to hear. Now, a university could take away the right of students to invite speakers, period. There's no constitutional right and the right of students to invite speakers to campus. You could say you can't do that, right? No students can invite speakers to campus. I think that would be terrible for an education environment in all sorts of ways, but you could do that, right? And you could say no student organization can invite speakers without the approval of a faculty board, because we want to monitor the quality. You could do that, right? The reasons I think we don't do that is because we want there to be this robust, open-ended, wide diversity of views. When we know that faculty members are bounded by what they think is good or bad. We see this all the time, right? And that shouldn't necessarily be the right standard for what ideas can be heard. So I would be very uncomfortable with a faculty board. Who would pick who's on the board, right? Now, again, if they were truly making honest, neutral judgments about the quality of the speaker in some objective, accurate manner, that would be okay. But I don't trust them to do that in the context of public discourse, frankly.
So my question relates to some of the students' concerns about Milo, I think. I'm just wondering, do you not see any potential for words to actually do harm in and of themselves, sort of in the same way that Canada perceives pornography, for example, or that some sexual harassment and sexual workplace, difficult workplace environment kind of legislation does. Can words not do harm?
Words can, of course, do harm. Threats are a good example, where they instill a kind of intentional, specific, focused fear on the part of an individual. And words can harm people in all sorts of ways, right? I mean, the notion that sticks and stones can hurt, can break your bones, but words can never harm you is crazy, right? There are all sorts of things that people may say to you or about your group that are hurtful, right? But the point is, one of the things, again, we've learned is you can't censor ideas because they are hurtful to other people. Because if you do that, you basically open the door to widespread censorship. And one of the things in a democracy or in a university is that people have to learn to cope with hurtful ideas. And that's part of the challenge of learning to be an effective, functioning adult. And to respond, as Obama said, fight them back on the battlefield of ideas. If they say something that hurts you, take a deep breath and call them an asshole and tell them why they're wrong. And that's the right thing to do, right? But to basically say you can't say things that upset me is the end of democracy, it's the end of freedom. Because then people will simply say, I'm upset, I'm upset, I'm upset. Every time somebody says something they don't like, oh my God, I'm traumatized, right? So nobody can say that again, right? That's not going to be the kind of intellectual environment you're going to want to live in. That's the problem.
I want to thank Professor Stone and thank the audience.
Thank you very much. Great questions. I've given talks like this 50 times. These are the best questions I've ever had.
And for those of you interested in this question, April 13th, we promised another really interesting discussion from a different point of view from today.
The wrong point of view.
We'll talk about that. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you.